Here's an interesting hand that I don't think that everyone plays the same way I do. Our opponent raises from the cutoff. We 3-bet on the button with pocket queens that our opponent calls. The flop comes ace, king, 7. How should we proceed with pocket queens? I think some players will argue that queens has no value on the flop, so you should check back and hopefully you can show down your hand. Some will say, oh, you should bet the flop, get a little bit of value, and then try to check down from there. I disagree with all of this. I think the best way you should play queens is to triple barrel all in. And not only do I think that you should triple barrel all in with queens, but I think you should do so more often than what GTO actually recommends. So let's look at the solve. Our opponent will obviously check his entire range to us on an ace, king, 7 flop because this flop is going to be so good for us. In position, we're really incentivized to bet itty bitty. Here, if you give the solver the option to bet 20%, 33%, or some larger sizings, it wants to bet 20% here. Really, really small. Why does it want to bet so small despite having such an enormous equity advantage? It's because when you bet really small, your opponent is going to have to fold nearly 50% of his range, assuming that he was playing pretty GTO in the first place. If your opponent is playing much wider here and has more garbage, well then they're going to have to fold even more hands, and then the small bet becomes even more dominating against them. Let's say your opponent calls with a hand like pocket eights, well then he's basically hoping that you never sneeze at the pot again, otherwise he's going to be paying off a much stronger range in general. So with our entire range, we're just going to bet really small. If you are a Overnight Monster student, if you followed my channel, that's not going to be a surprising play from a solver at all. So what does our opponent now do? He's mostly going to call with his aces, he's going to call with his kings, mostly going to fold his smaller hands. Let's say the turn is a relative blank, a 5 of clubs, and it checks. We should be betting queens and jacks on the turn. Now, I think that you should actually be betting queens more often than what a solver recommends. Let's break it down why. Let's say now we bet large with queens, our opponent calls, and the river again comes, a relative blank. Let's say it's the deuce of spades here. When we do arrive at the river with queens here, we should probably always jam here. When we arrive at the river with jacks, we should probably check. Why should we jam queens, but then check jacks? Well, whenever you have one of these strange actions that you're unsure of why it is the case, you should often look to how your opponent reacts against you. We see that after we shove the river here, our opponent is mostly going to call ace-queen, and he's mostly going to fold ace-jack. So, when we want to bluff our opponent off of a hand, we're mostly trying to get him off of ace-queen by the river, which means that we should be shoving queens because it increases the likelihood he's going to have ace-jack or worse. If we think that our opponent reaches the river with a lot of ace-jack and is going to call ace-jack, then shoving jacks here becomes much better as well. But why is it that I actually recommend jamming queens here more than what GTO recommends? It's because when I jam here on the river, as we can see in this part of the game tree, our opponent actually does not have that many ace-queen here. Why is that? One, when you're playing against GTO opponents, when they have ace-queen offsuit, they're often going to be 4-betting it pre-flop. In this particular solve, we only have ace-queen offsuit 20% of the time here, and if you're playing against opponents who are much more passive, it's possible that they have ace-queen offsuit here 75 to 100% of the time. Same with a hand like ace-queen suited. Additionally, when you bet so small on the flop, what is one of the most obvious value hands that should check raise you? Well, it should be ace-queen. Well, I don't always know if in reality on these boards, when I bet 20 to 30%, if my opponents are actually check-raising ace-queen or if they are too passive. So the more passive your opponent is, both pre-flop and on the flop, the more likely that ace-queen becomes the exact hand that you want to target by the river. Inversely, if your opponent is wildly aggressive with ace-queen, always 4-bets it pre-flop, always check-raises it on the flop, well, then you have almost no incentive to triple-barrel queens because your opponent is not going to be able to have ace-queen in his range by the river. However, that probably means then, when you get to the river, your opponent's most likely calling range is going to be ace-jack, in which case jacks becomes a much better shove. So, if you're wondering, oh man, how do I use PIOsolver? I've kind of given away a bunch of the secrets in this one hand. I use PIOsolver often to look at what efficient bet sizes are in a given formation. I try to identify categories of hand types that I should be firing across multiple streets and across multiple lines. And then when I'm unsure of why I should be taking an action, I'm often looking at what its blocker and unblocker effects are and trying to realistically determine if the formation that we have arrived at is realistic and it looks like what my play looks like. And so if I think, wow, you know, my opponent has ace-queen here a lot, shoving queens is a lot better. If my opponent calls with ace-jack here a lot, shoving jacks is a lot better. And so when you understand how these blocker effects kind of shape your opponent's calling and folding ranges, that's really the true power of PIOsolver and why moment to moment you don't really need that much memorization of a particular strategy, but rather you can ask yourself some basic quantitative questions about your opponent's ranges and then come out with a very nasty GTO-inspired counter strategy. So I hope this kind of clarifies how you should be using PIOsolver, kind of also reveals a really cool bluff, and hopefully you can take this information and find a bunch of other interesting gems. I made an extended version of this video about how to use PIOsolver effectively that is much more long and tangential that I will be posting into the Overnight Monster course for everyone who is a student of my system. But otherwise, if you are in any stakes of the game, I really think you should be considering the triple barrel queens hand when the board is exactly ace-king high. This is Alvin Teaches Poker. Good luck. I'll talk to you guys soon.